In today's video, I'm going to teach you how to add columns to a pivot table slicer in Excel. First, open Microsoft Excel and go to the workbook where you want to work with your pivot table and slicer. If you're practicing from scratch, that's perfectly fine too. The main idea here is that slicers can become much easier to use when their buttons are displayed in multiple columns instead of one long vertical list. This is especially helpful when you have several filter items and you want the slicer to take up less vertical space on your worksheet. Rather than scrolling through a tall list, you can organize the slicer buttons into a cleaner grid layout that's quicker to read and click. To demonstrate this, use a simple sample data set with fields like region, product, and sales. For example, your region values might include North, South, East, and West. Once that data is ready, create a pivot table from it, and then add a slicer for the region field. This gives you a practical example to work with while adjusting the slicer layout. Now click anywhere on the slicer itself. This is important because selecting the slicer reveals the Slicer tab, sometimes labeled Slicer Tools, on the ribbon. Once you're there, look for the Buttons group. Inside that section, you'll find the Columns setting. In the Columns box, enter the number of columns you want the slicer to display. For example, you might type 2, 3, or 4, depending on how many items are in the slicer and how wide you want it to appear. As soon as you change that value, Excel rearranges the slicer buttons into multiple columns. If needed, adjust the slicer's width so all the columns display properly. This part matters because if the slicer is too narrow, the new column layout may not be easy to see. Simply drag the edge of the slicer until the buttons fit comfortably and the layout looks balanced. For example, with one column, the slicer might show North, South, East, and West in a single vertical list. With two columns, those same items can be displayed in a more compact grid, making the slicer easier to scan at a glance. That's all there is to it. By clicking the slicer, going to the Slicer tab, finding the Columns option, and entering the number of columns you want, you can quickly improve the appearance and usability of your pivot table slicer. This is a small formatting change, but it can make your Excel dashboards look much more polished and user-friendly.